Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Marjat, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. It's almost here. We've got less than a month now until Election Day 2024. And in the final weeks, candidates and surrogates, realizing how critical the Silver State is, are spending a lot of time in Nevada. Just this week, we've got both Walz and Trump. The Minnesota governor and Kamala Harris's running mate came back for a rally after his last visit had to be switched up because of the Davis fire. Before we get into the bulk of this week's show, let's take you out to Walz's rally just last night in Reno.
The future Vice President of the United States, ladies and gentlemen, Governor Tim Walz.
It's a Tuesday. I'd like to see this crowd on Saturday night. I'll tell you, so ready to go. In the only presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump stood up and said they're eating cats, they're eating dogs. When he did that, the Republican governor of Ohio, was forced to send state law enforcement to escort children to school. And none of it was true. Donald Trump also said, instead of being like Ronald Reagan and standing up to the Russians and their expansion, Donald Trump told the Russians, do whatever the hell you want to one of our allies as they rolled into the Ukraine. She stood up to transnational gangs trying to human traffic or move drugs, and she stood up to corporate interest. And this is the thing that we're all hungry for. She never hesitated to reach across the aisle and work together to solve problems. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for. So 28 days, and the vice president said it. When we fight, we win. When we fight, we win. When we vote, we win. Let's go.
And former President Donald Trump is coming Friday for a campaign rally at the same location, Reno's Grand Sierra Resort. We'll have a recap of that rally next week. All right, if you haven't heard, we're hosting a debate on Question 3, Nevada's ranked choice voting and open primaries ballot measure. The first Ballot Battleground Nevada debate is airing next week, Tuesday, October 15th at 4:30 on News 4 and Fox 11, as well as at 3:30 on KSNV News 3 down in Southern Nevada. We brought in two representatives from both sides authorized by the Yes and No campaigns, but we wanted to bring you a few other perspectives on this massive change to our electoral system. First up, you'll hear from Doug Goodman, the founder of Nevadans for Election Reform. A little later, you'll hear from John Tsarpalas, president of the Nevada Policy Research Institute, a conservative policy think tank that is opposed to Question 3. And stick around until the end. We've got another installment of our fact-checking segment. This week, we pick apart two ads in the race for Nevada's 2nd Congressional District, which covers most of northern Nevada. We'll examine the claims made by both incumbent Representative Mark Amodei and the nonpartisan challenger Greg Kidd. First up, though, our conversation with Doug Goodman. We're joined now by Doug Goodman, the founder of Nevadans for Election Reform. For real this time, because we had you for a pilot episode before this show even launched, last October, November? It's like a year ago now.
Oh, it's been a while, yeah, but I really appreciated being the pilot and glad I could help in that respect.
Well, you must have been such a good guest that the higher-ups greenlit the show, and here we are having you back for real. It's a bummer that it's taken this long to get you back, but
no problem.
Here we are talking about Question 3 ahead of our debate that's airing next week, and as I mentioned in the intro to this segment, wanting to get some different perspectives other than the voices that you'll hear during the debate next week, and I think you, Doug, is a great place to start because you are one of the people that's been fighting for this for many years now. So when and why did you start kind of advocating for open primaries and ranked choice voting in Nevada?
It actually goes back to 2013. I registered nonpartisan in 2010 after over 30 years as a Republican. But it got to the point where people weren't talking to each other. Politicians, elected officials weren't working together anymore. And it was just something had to be done. And so back in 2013, the idea I had back then was a top 3 primary with ranked choice voting. I said, okay, if something's going to happen in Nevada, I've got to do it. And so I just started calling business leaders, legislators. The actual benefit, the result of this was in 2015, during the session, Patty Farley and Jim Settlemeyer actually filed a bill draft. The Legislative Counsel Bureau, LCB, came back and said, well, ranked choice voting violates 2 sections of the Nevada Constitution. The fact that LCB stated their opinion back then, that's why question 3 is a constitutional amendment. Because we've got the opinion back, even though it's, 2015, so we have to change the Constitution.
Yeah, this has kind of been bubbling up with various bills and grassroots efforts over the last several years.
Exactly.
And the trend that really is driving all of this is the nonpartisan voter, of course, which now, correct me if I'm wrong, this is going to be the first election in Nevada history, right, where neither of the political parties is the biggest group of the electorate. It's the nonpartisans, and if you include all the third-party voters, right,
yes.
40-something%.
Yeah.
They're bigger than either of the 2 political parties, and so we have this massive chunk of our electorate that doesn't have a say in our primaries. Let's talk about this question now, which I won't exactly go over all of it. I will put a link in the show notes to a previous episode we did that went into a heck of a lot more detail, but long story short, if you are a new listener, unfamiliar with the ballot measure, Nevada's primaries are closed right now, and this would open them up. So every person would have, the same ballot essentially with all of the candidates on it, regardless of party. Everyone would vote. The top 5 vote getters would advance to the general election, which would be a ranked choice general election. You can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as few or as many candidates that you can rank in the general as you like, and then you need 50% to win in the ranked choice general election. I'll skip over kind of the exact counting, which I've gone over in more detail in the past. Why do you think that's a better system than the one we have right now?
Well, first of all, you look at the number of voters who are not participating because they don't, they're not members of a political party. A long time ago, a legislator told me, you shouldn't have to be a member of a political party to vote, member of a private organization. You look at specifically younger voters. Among the 18 to 34-year-olds, almost 60% of that age group, registered voters, are not D or R, are not affiliated. Over 55% are nonpartisan. And so given this, the nonpartisan open primary where all candidates are on the ballot regardless of party, that forces candidates to talk to all the voters. That's going to force the candidates to talk to almost 1 million voters right now that don't pay attention. I mean, when you get a ballot that has one race for the primary, why bother?
Yeah,
and so I think what the system of, first of all, the open primary, the nonpartisan open primary does, it gives voters a reason to pay attention because now they have a voice. And then in the general, okay, I don't have to go in and say, oh, I really like this candidate, but, or if I vote for this candidate, I'm going to be a spoiler. I'm actually giving my vote to the other guy. And so, you can go in and vote for one. Nothing's preventing you. Or you can go in and say, I like this candidate, first choice. If they don't make it, second choice. The idea of ranking lets you say, okay, I like this candidate. But, if this candidate doesn't make it, I could live with this candidate or this candidate. And my vote still matters. Your vote still counts. You're not just voting, oh, my candidate lost, and the other candidate won with 40-something% of the vote, meaning 60% didn't like that candidate. So it corrects that. It gives us a more representative system, more diverse elected body, but even more so, it allows legislators to go forward and not have to worry about, I'm going to be primaried.
Yeah.
And this is all proven. You find legislators working more together. You actually find candidates campaigning together, saying, if you don't like me as your first choice, can I have your second choice vote? That's what this does. It makes it more civil, issue-oriented, solution oriented, and that's the beauty part of this.
Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you about one of the criticisms, which is, there have been studies showing that a lot more ballots tend to get thrown out, at least according to this, I believe it was 2022 University of Pennsylvania study that's been referenced a lot. This presumably would boost turnout because, at least in the primaries, because it's bringing all these nonpartisan voters in. But if so many people don't understand how this works and their ballot gets tossed out, aren't voters going to be disenfranchised?
It's voter education, first of all. That's one of the reasons why we've been talking about ranked choice voting in groups we've been meeting with the last 2 years. First of all, you're only talking mail ballots that have errors. If you vote in person on a machine, the machine doesn't let you make an error. And the other thing you have to look at is right now, this last cycle, the presidential primary and the June primary, I think there was approximately 10,000 ballots that were uncured. That's a voter education issue too. So what people are saying, well, if you overvote. Right now, if you overvote, your ballot's thrown out. That race is not counted. If the adjudication folks at the registrar of voters can't ascertain your intent. So overvoting in ranked choice, if you mark two candidates, at the same ranking, or if you rank the same candidate twice, only that race is discarded. Your full ballot counts. And again, it goes back, we admit, voter education is going to be critical in this. Also, there's, some idea, what if we created a little template that's sent out with the mail ballot that will prevent you from overvoting? If you're worried about making a problem, vote in person. If you're not, if you just be careful. And we need to get voter education. The legislature, when we pass, and I'm optimistic, I'm going to say when, not if, needs to fund voter education on this. So we can really, and we will continue doing our efforts to get out there in front of groups. Say, this is how you rank if you want to. These are the things you need to be careful of. The instructions on the ballot itself need to be clear. In the ballot design, the instructions need to say, if you rank, make sure it's only one vote per candidate, one vote per column. So it's clear to voters.
Absolutely. That voter education piece will be critical, essential if this were to pass. So Doug Goodman, the founder of Nevadans for Election Reform, really appreciate you coming in today and explaining kind of why you support Question 3 and why you've been fighting for it for so long. So thank you so much for coming in, Doug.
Ben, thank you very much for having me back. Really appreciate it.
Next up, John Tsarpalas, who runs the Nevada Policy Research Institute, a think tank with a more conservative perspective. All right, welcome, John Tsarpalas, the president of the Nevada Policy Research Institute. So good to have you here in studio. John, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Ben. I'm excited to be here.
Just flew up this morning from Las Vegas. How's the southern end of our state do? You hopefully got to see the implosion of the Tropicana this morning.
Well, that happened at 2 a.m. and I didn't get up for it, and I didn't want to, have a cloud of dust in my face. So I missed that.
What a historic moment.
Been the big talk.
For sure.
So we'll see the video tonight.
Yeah, they're very good. For our listeners who might not know, what is NPRI? What do you guys do? How long have you guys been around, and what's kind of your mission?
Nevada Policy's been around 33 years, originally started up here in Reno, and the mission was to keep us a low-tax, income tax-free state, make sure that we tried to keep business regulation down so that we were a prosperous state. Also, over time, grew into school choice because our school systems are so troubled and bad, and we have to have an educated populace if we're going to have a prosperous populace.
How did you guys find yourselves opposing Question 3? What's kind of the more conservative perspective on why you guys feel Nevadans should not vote for Q3?
Well, we got involved in election integrity during COVID when suddenly the election laws changed. And we decided as a research institute that we should do a good, solid study, a report on what the election laws for a gold standard, where it's easy to vote and people are not confused by systems, and they also have a good sense that there's no fraud going on, that the elections are fair and honest. And also just reliability. And then along came ranked choice voting in 2022. It is a constitutional amendment to our it's a ballot question that amends our Constitution. And we were really troubled by the ads for the Vote Yes side because it only talked about the primary. It did not talk about ranked choice voting, which we think is the more troublesome part of this. But also the ads were half-truths. I mean, it was, hi, I'm a military veteran, and I can't vote in the primary. Well, that's not the truth. I'm a military veteran who chooses not to choose a party to register under, therefore I could get a ballot. And I'm also a military veteran who ignores the fact that you can register for a party for one day and unregister the next day, and so you could vote. But we also understand that the primaries for the independents, who are the largest group of registered voters, are problematic. But there are lots of other choices. An open primary such as New Hampshire, where if the independents just get to pick one of the ballots. But Nevada policy asks the bigger question, why do we have two private political organizations, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, having the voters pay for the primary vote for their organization, and yet smaller parties, the Libertarians, the Independents, et cetera, have to finance their own conference or caucus or some type of a vote. And years ago, this was not a government function, the primaries. Why don't we go back to having the two parties do it, and then we're not being unfair to the independents because they're paying part of the cost of the primary?
Would you guys, there are people out there that support the open primaries and are against the ranked choice voting. Are you guys against both elements of this then?
We're against both elements. Something needs to be done about the primaries. We prefer that they go back to the parties, let the parties pay for their own thing. They are private clubs. And when an independent says, well, I can't vote in your primary, it's like, well, you don't want to join the Elks Club, but you want to vote in their decision for who's going to be their leadership or who's going to be in their final rounds of an election. So it's a freedom of association problem, this choice, and there's better choices than a California-style jungle open primary, final five. 5 is a lot, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I believe it was Alaska, I think, that has 4. I think there's other places that might only have 3 candidates. Nevada going with the top 5 is the measure that's going to be on the ballot. What's your issue with ranked choice voting specifically?
It brings in a whole new way of voting, and people will have to be educated, which they can, but this is a very complicated system. One of the other things, too, that we need to remember is right now, if this should pass, you're going to have voting for president by a primary and then a simple plurality, not a majority, in the general election, like we always have. Then you're going to have 10 elections, 10 seats, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, the statewide, governor, et cetera, and the legislative seats, state legislature. Those would happen under open primary ranked choice voting. And then at the county level, it's a partisan straight plurality, plain old primary that we're used to, closed primary. And then when you get to the local elections, those are nonpartisan, and often if someone gets 50% coming out of the primary, they've won. So you've got 4 systems of voting happening in one election. That's adding to confusion. But now let's get to your question about ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is confusing. You have to pick when you are voting, that's before Election Day. It's not like you get to go back and find out who was left and who's not. And it is possible in the primary that you could have 1,000 people running for governor. There are no limits in an open primary. You're not only bringing one candidate from different parties. Oh, and I want to correct something that a different think tank said. And that is, this is going to help the smaller parties. It would help if they can get through the primary. But a Libertarian Party, a Green Party is going to have a very hard time making that final 5. It's very possible we could end up with 4, 5, 3 Democrats, 1, 2 Republicans, and never see another party get to the general election. Where right now, those smaller parties have a spot on the general election ballot. So at least they show up. And that's why all the parties in this state are opposed to this.
Yeah, I think you could definitely envision instances where 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans advance and maybe one third party candidate advances, but the other don't. And so, they would not be secured a spot on the general election ballot. But I do want to circle back to the argument that we hear oftentimes, which is that it is confusing. I understand that the exact tabulation of how you get to 50% might be a little confusing, but for the voter side, they don't necessarily need to understand that part because it's going to be done by computers. For the voters that are filling out their ballot, what is so difficult about going, this is my favorite candidate, this is my second favorite, this is my third favorite?
Okay, so I know that I know quite a bit about elections, but I always save the newspaper endorsements and try to figure out, because some of the lower candidates you don't know. I sit down at my kitchen table and I try to figure out who am I voting for, especially for the lower offices, because I haven't made up my mind. You are now supposed to make 5 choices for each one of those 10 offices under ranked choice voting, or you run the risk of having an incomplete ballot, which could cause exhaustion, but that isn't necessarily going to happen to you. It depends on who your first choice was and where they come up. So first of all, just think about if you're doing that in a polling place, how much slower that's going to be. And hopefully you've made up your mind. But now you're doing research on 50 people because it's 10 different levels and 5 choices in each one. How will people actually do that? We're pushing people to try and be more involved versus trying to make the system simpler and easier for people. And then there's the idea of, do you really want your third or fourth choice to win? And right now there are people who I would never write in as the 5th choice because I just know I would never want them elected. Mm-hmm. And there's also sort of a feeling of people that when I talk to folks that, I'm being pushed to support people I don't really want, but I'm sort of condoning it, sanction of the victim, so to speak. So,
but you don't have to fill out the full ballot.
I understand that, but you also then run the risk that your ballot is not counted.
Yeah.
So where was this? This was back in Maine, I believe. Yes, Maine 2nd Congressional. There were 126,000 and something votes cast, but in the end, only 117 were counted because 9,000 ended up being exhausted. So you thought you voted, you thought somehow you would be part of the process, and then your ballot was put on the side. Again, that's going to give people a feeling of, I don't know what's up, how did that happen? It's not simple, it's not clear cut. I imagine they'll kind of get used to it, but will they ever have a feeling of, this election really feels solid and certified and there was nothing going wrong?
Interesting. What else are we leaving out here? What are some of the other cases that you guys have been making, or what's something that you want Nevadans to really think about?
Well, things that have been said on the yes side is that this is going to help turn out for different racial groups, under voted groups. That doesn't change anywhere with ranked choice voting. In Alaska, we did see last cycle that it dropped off a bit, that less people are voting because they've got more decisions to make. It's harder. So it can create less turnout, not more turnout. The bottom line is this should never have been a constitutional amendment. We should have tried this in maybe Reno and Vegas in the election for mayor and see if people liked it. This system was used in America right around 1890, 1900, and by 1910 it was removed everywhere because people didn't like it. And I think we're going to see the same, if this should pass, and people just should simply vote no on 3, and let's come up with a better solution on the primaries, and stick to the simple, tried and true system of the majority wins. I mean, people can understand that easily.
But a majority doesn't always win under our current system.
It's
only a plurality. You could have a scenario where it's 41 or 42% of the vote and a candidate wins. They have a mandate by virtue of them winning the race, but they have not earned the support of half of the voters.
Okay, so the yes side is saying a majority always wins. That's not true when you have the ballot exhaustion. One of those 9,000 votes, I don't know the exact percentage there, you did not have 100% of the people voting creating the majority in round 3. You had 100% of the ballots left in. A majority of the ballots left, but not the ballots thrown out. So you're never going to get to a majority of what the people voted. So don't fall for that kind of shuffle of numbers.
Yeah.
Just isn't.
And I forget which state it was. It was Maine or Alaska in last week's episode where the reporter we spoke to said that there was one party that had been having candidates drop out of the race. Say if two Republicans advanced to the general, one of them would drop out if they had lesser support because they were worried about the fact that people might not fill out their first and second choice. They were worried about splitting up the vote because so many people were having their ballots exhausted. So that was definitely a concern, at least in that state presented too.
Correct. I mean, that happened in the Mary Patola race against, she was vice
Sarah
president,
Palin.
Sarah Palin,
Yeah.
against Sarah Palin. There was two Republicans running, one Democrat, and therefore the Democrat won because the Republicans split their vote. And so it works well in states where the minority party wants to get ahead if they can control what's going on. That's also a problem here in both the primary and the general. Those with better organization, better control over their candidates will have better odds of winning.
What's the last thing that you want voters to consider when they're walking in that voting booth and it's a coin toss for them? What's the last thing that you want them to think about?
Ranked choice voting is confusing and difficult and will make it harder for you to make up your mind and then to see how the outcome happened.
John Tsarpalas with the NPRI Nevada Policy. Thank you so much for coming in today. We really appreciate getting some of your time.
Thank you, Ben. It's been fun.
A special thanks to both Doug and John for joining us this week. Before we go, News 4 and Fox 11 has committed to fact-checking the ads you see on our airwaves so that viewers get the full story. In this week's edition of our fact-checking segment, we'll examine ads from incumbent Republican Mark Amodei and the nonpartisan challenger Greg Kidd, two candidates for Nevada's 2nd Congressional District. Amodei is trying to brand Kidd as more of a Democrat than a true nonpartisan. Kidd is trying to brand Amodei as someone who hasn't gotten much done in Congress. Let's start with Amodei's 30-second ad called How We Are Judged.
In this business, we're all judged by who we give money to. My opponent's given money to the California Democratic Party, Act Blue. They support Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Adam Schiff. He's also given money to about a half dozen of Chuck Schumer's Senate candidates. Does that sound nonpartisan or fresh to you? Nope. Paid for by Amodei for Nevada. I'm Congressman Mark Amodei, and I approve this message.
As you heard there, the spot focuses on Kidd's campaign contributions to various Democratic groups and candidates. We should point out that Kidd was a registered Republican prior to filing to run for this race. But yes, according to Federal Election Commission records, Kidd has donated to the California Democratic Party, several Democratic candidates for U.S. Senate, as well as Act Blue, which is a Democratic super PAC. Kidd has not donated directly to Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or Adam Schiff, but that Act Blue PAC does support many Democratic candidates, including them. Campaign officials did say Kidd has donated to both Republican Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming and, interestingly enough, Nevada Republican Senate candidate Sam Brown, despite Kidd also donating to and having been endorsed by Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen. Now, Kidd is running an ad claiming that Mark Amodei hasn't accomplished much in the way of passing legislation during his 13 years in Congress. Here's his 15-second ad.
In 12 years in Congress, Mark Amodei has only gotten 5 bills passed. Meanwhile, he's voted against funding for our district that would ease traffic, create clean energy infrastructure, and bring high-paying jobs. Maybe we should send someone to Congress who will actually do stuff.
As you heard there, the ad claims that Amodei has only passed 5 bills in his 12 years in Congress and that he's voted against funding to ease traffic and support clean energy infrastructure and high-paying jobs. According to Congress's official website, there have been 2 bills with Amodei as the main sponsor that have passed through both chambers of Congress and become law, as well as 3 appropriations acts dealing with funding that he was the main sponsor of, making that 5 pieces of legislation he's passed. Of course, when you include bills Amodei has co-sponsored, that number jumps way up. 70 bills that he has been a co-sponsor of have become law. The claim about voting against funding to ease traffic, support clean energy infrastructure, and high-paying jobs refers to Amodei's no vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, the major spending package passed by Democrats in 2022. That legislation funded loans for clean energy projects, energy-efficient appliance rebates for consumers, and has contributed to the creation of 20,000 new clean energy jobs in Nevada in the 2 years since that bill became law. For Amodei's part, he said the 2 bills in question in that ad added about $4 trillion to the national deficit. He said what they've done to the economy is catastrophic and that he stands behind those no votes. If you made it to the end of this episode, we really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, anything at all, feel free to shoot us an email to bjmargiot, MARGIOTT, at sbgtv.com and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. If you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review so more people can discover our show. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to watch the debate next Tuesday. If you do miss it, we'll have the full debate dropped in this feed shortly after it airs.